Hello, everybody. My name is Derek Horvath. Today we have the African American Education Historical Timeline. To start with our front cover here, we have a picture of Elias Noe. This man opened the first African American school in New York City way back in 1704. This was one of the first schools of its kind in our country's history. For our first big event, we have Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson was an 1896 Supreme Court decision in which the court ruled that racial segregation laws did not violate the U.S. Constitution as long as the facilities for each race were equal in quality. This doctrine came to be known as separate but equal. Long story short, schools for African American students compared to those for the white students were very much not equal. For decades to come, individuals did what they could to overcome this reality for African American students. Julius Rosenwald is one of many who was a big advocate for African American education, himself funding the construction of 6 schools in Alabama in 1912. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark 1954 Supreme Court case in which the justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are equal. 3 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, in 1957, the gears of change were still turning, and it was time for 9 African American students to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. After days of pushback from angry mobs and National Guard troops blocking the school entrances, President Dwight Eisenhower federalized the Guard and sent in additional troops to escort those students to school. It became a national story of success for desegregation. 9 years after Brown v. Board of Education in 1963, there were still parts of the country finding every legal loophole to not desegregate. Here we have George Wallace pictured physically blocking 2 potential African American students from entering the University of Alabama auditorium. President Kennedy sent the Deputy Attorney General, federal marshals, and the Alabama National Guard to Wallace to demand him to step aside. At first, he did not, arguing the 10th Amendment and that it is the state of Alabama that supersedes the federal government in this circumstance. Kennedy then sent a high-ranking brigadier general with more troops to physically remove the governor if needed, but the governor did finally comply. We then take a big jump to a notable study from 2008, only 15 years ago. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the percentage of all 18 to 24-year-old African Americans enrolled in higher education increased from 21.2% in 1988 to 32.6%. This is an example of the progress that has been made throughout the last few decades. When we jump to today, full equality and integration has thankfully been achieved for African American students in the United States. And lastly, for my made-up piece of legislation, I have the Urban Area Mentorship Act of 2023. This bill would provide funding for low-income urban school districts to hire temporary mentors who are successful adults who also grew up in that region. Students will be able to see real-life success stories from individuals they will be able to closely relate to. Here are my sources, and thank you for listening.